Well, now we're going to talk about chapter extension 11, which is entitled Hypersocial Organizations and Knowledge Management. However, we're only going to focus on questions 2 and 3 from this extension. So what are the benefits of knowledge management and what are expert systems? Before we answer the first question now, what I want to do is ask why knowledge management. And it's something I wish they had covered. And maybe we do it a little bit in the first part. But, there's this, if you think about an organization, right, there's a lot of people in the organization, and these people have lots of knowledge, right? But the knowledge is within each individual person's head. Well, that's great, but what we, as an organization, though, we have all this knowledge in our employees that is there, and it's usually being used, but is there a way we can facilitate the transfer of that knowledge from one person to another, so that way the knowledge that's already there, that's been developed over time, that these employees that have been working for 20 years or more, are incredibly knowledgeable people, but how can we not take advantage of, but to capture that knowledge and make sure that what they've learned stays with the organization, so the organization stays strong long term, right? So why knowledge management? Well, number one is it helps tremendously with decision making. The more knowledge you have, the better decisions you can make. That's a general truth, right? The less knowledge you have, the harder it is to make good decisions. Well, knowledge management, and that's kind of the core of it. Number two, though, is we want to help with retention of our current employees. So we want to give more acknowledgement to employees that are doing well and have this knowledge and are really helpful for the organization, right? Because we want them to stay. We want valuable employees to stay. And if they have knowledge and they're willing to share it, that's a great thing, and we want to reward that and keep them with the organization because those are very, very valuable people. And lastly, we want to help with attrition. So this is employees that leave the organization, because when they leave, their knowledge that's in their head goes with them unless we capture that in some way. Now, I'm not just talking about people that leave because they're fired or people that leave to go work for somebody else. We're also talking about people that retire, right? So they may be very satisfied with working for your company, but they're getting older and they're just saying, hey, I've saved up enough money, I'm ready to retire. So why is that, especially that last one, why is that really important? Well, think about this. Right now, there's a demographic change going on in our society. In particular, one demographic group called our baby boomers are probably a huge segment of the workforce, an extremely knowledgeable and extremely, an extremely large group of people that are all rapidly approaching retirement. My dad was probably one of the first baby boomers, born in 1945, just retired a couple years ago, right? My mom's a few years younger. She still considered baby boomer, born in, 51. She didn't work, but, she stayed at home, but she's also to that age where people are considering, right? And I know other people around that same age group that are either talking about retiring or are retiring currently. What's going to happen to the knowledge of those people when they retire? So, for example, my dad, near the end of his career, he started as a database administrator, but near the end of his career, he actually went into consulting and was one of the few people out there who knew anything about mainframes. Right? He wasn't good at them, but he was like one of the, because he just didn't do it for most of his career. Most of his career was in database administration, not in programming mainframes. But the fact of the matter is, he was one of the few that actually did work with it. And so he was able to get some, pretty lucrative consulting gigs working with mainframes, right? So he had this knowledge, a very rare piece of knowledge. But when he retired, he was like, I'm not doing this anymore. right? He doesn't need a consultant. He's got enough money. And this is what's going on throughout our entire, especially within the U.S., what a big segment of very, very knowledgeable people are all retiring. What is that going to mean to business, right? And so they want to try to capture as much of that knowledge as they can and pass it on to the younger generations. So the Generation X, Generation Y, the millennials, all these people that were, that are still coming up and developing within businesses, we want to pass that knowledge on in some way. So the question is, how best can we do that? So that is why knowledge management is such a very, how should I say, it's the important component that a lot of businesses, if they're not already currently thinking about, should start thinking about. So the traditional view of knowledge management is that we want to create value from intellectual capital, so the thoughts inside people's heads, and sharing that knowledge with those that need the capital. Especially the younger people or the newer people in an organization that need to learn how the business works. So there's a process of training. I mean, you could just say, well, we're going to train people, we're going to go through classes, but that's not always feasible. And there might be different ways, such as capturing documents, capturing videos, capturing workflows. But how do you pass on that information most efficiently? And there's a lot that goes into this, really understanding that process. So it's not just about training, though. It also goes into helping people to make decisions when they're working through, let's say, a project, So you want to preserve the organizational memory. Now, an organization, technically doesn't have a memory, right? Only people have memories. But the concept is that the organization has all this stuff going on within it. We don't want that to disappear when individuals leave, right? So we want to try to capture as much of that, what's going on, and store those lessons learned and the best practices of key employees. With the overall goal is to enable employees to use organizations' collective knowledge, so that new employees and younger employees can effectively take that knowledge and apply it to the situations that they're currently working in. Well, that was the traditional view, all right? It's now evolving. So knowledge management, and this is kind of a cornerstone where you need to hit first, right, is to do this. But we're getting to the point now, and specifically this is how it applies to the social aspect of business. The new things that knowledge management is trying to accomplish include fostering innovation by passing ideas around. So it's not just capturing best practices, but also getting ideas for doing things differently because everyone's sharing more information and more knowledge. And we includes in trying to improve customer service by streamlining response time. Right? So the more knowledge that's captured, the better you can get to the answers to help your customers. So you got better customer service. To boost revenues by getting products and services to market faster. And so you see this in companies. Well, for example, let me think here. The car industry recently went through some major changes in how they structure their new car product development. So that new models, it used to take them 3 years to go from the model conception until it goes into production, and now they're trying to cut that down to 18 months to 12 months into even less, so that they can go. But this requires vast amount of knowledge and integrated knowledge that's being shared across the entire company, from the product development side all the way to the manufacturing side. We want to enhance employee retention rates by recognizing employee value. So I mentioned that earlier. That's an important part of knowledge management. So it's not just about capturing that knowledge, but also helping employees feel like they belong, feel like they're valuable, feel like they're adding something to something bigger than themselves, that they're taking part in creating something big and important. And you also want to streamline operations, reduce costs by eliminating unnecessary processes. And so the more information, the more knowledge that is shared, the easier it is to identify these unnecessary processes. And by identifying them, you can then cut them out, right? All right. Well, it's a pretty short discussion on knowledge management in the book, and we'll leave it at that. Now, I've taken an entire course in knowledge management, an entire semester-long course. So there's a lot we can talk about here about how to go about doing it. Obviously, in a class like this, we simply can't dig in that deep, and so we won't. But just know that this is a very, very important concept for businesses to try to grasp and use. And even if you don't have necessarily not a specific knowledge management system, because there's actually information systems designed for knowledge management. And it's not always just about the system. Sometimes it's about the processes around sharing information. And sometimes that can be facilitated through social media. All right, but let's go ahead and move on to the next question. What are expert systems? And why use them, right? So an expert system is an artificial intelligence system. So there's different types of artificial intelligence. An expert system is one of those. All right, it's a knowledge-based system. So this kind of applies to our knowledge management in the prior discussion. Now, what I didn't really like about the book here is that it only talks about one artificial intelligence system. And maybe it does in some of the other chapter extensions. I haven't found one yet. But there's actually a lot of different types of artificial intelligence. Expert systems are basically rule-based systems that encode human knowledge in the form of if-then statements. So a rule-based system that encodes human knowledge in the form of if-then statements. So if you are a junior, then you may sign up for junior level classes. If you have completed this class, this class, this class, and this class, then you may declare your major in the business school, right? So there's rules like that, right? But there's different types of if-then statements and different types of expert system, and they can be used for two different major problems. There's diagnostic problems, in other words, what's wrong, and prescriptive problems, what to do. And so, for example, let's say you take a snake bite, right? Well, if you get bit by a snake, and maybe you don't know anything about snakes, right? What might be the problem? Well, what's wrong? Well, some snakes are poisonous, right? And what you could do then is develop a set of if-then statements. So if the snake has a certain pattern on its scales, that means it is poisonous. Or if a snake has a rattle on the end, that means it's a rattlesnake and it's poisonous. So now we've identified, or maybe if you were... if after the snake bite your skin starts to swell and get red, it may be poisonous, right? So those are diagnostic type problems. So what's wrong? Then the question is, what do you do about it, right? So if you have been poisoned, then you should do what, right? Probably the first choice. If you have been poisoned and you're within a close vicinity of a hospital, get there first, right? So do that first. If you're not within a close, so again, another if statement, if you're not in close vicinity of a hospital, then there are ways you can slow or stop the spread of the poison. So that might be the next thing that you would do. So, and I'm no doctor, so I can't really describe the exact specific prescriptive things that you can do here, but you get the point, right? And so that's where someone like a doctor, though, could come in and define these if-then statements. Like there should be a set of best practices for diagnosing the problem and prescribing a solution. And if you follow these set rules, you can hopefully avoid serious problems. So, and here's the thing though. Expert systems need to be programmed with the knowledge of an expert. Right? So it's not just a matter of guessing like I was doing, right? Guessing isn't acceptable, right? You got to have an expert who can put that knowledge into the system and define the rules. Now, there's some problems with that. Number one, experts can't always describe their rationale. Sometimes it's almost more intuitive that they can kind of just know what the answer is. Now, intuition isn't necessarily bad if it's coming from an expert, because usually experts have developed this intuition over looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of cases, and sometimes they can just look and go, I know there's a problem here, I don't know what it is, but I'm going to do this because of it. Right? So that they may not be able to actually define or necessarily identify a specific rule that can go along with it. It's just kind of, they intuited the answer. Experts are not always willing to share, because in order to define all these rules, it takes a lot of time. And so an expert, a lot of these experts are getting paid lots of money because they are experts at what they do. So you can't necessarily say, oh, well, I need you to put all this information in here. Well, I don't have time to do that. I'm busy working. Or why should I share all this information? Wouldn't this make my job go away? I mean, seriously. Or will I be held liable if I screw this up? So there might be a lot of situations where the experts aren't willing to share their knowledge. And sometimes you just can't program everything. There are situations where it's just too complex of a decision to be able to be programmed it. And we'll talk about one situation where things get a little fuzzier. Now, there is a way to get around fuzziness, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But realize that there are situations, though, especially like when I said when there's intuition being used, right? That can't be programmed. You can't program intuition. Now, we do have the ability for different types of artificial intelligence, things like called neural networks. What's it? Drawing a blank now. Type of system that essentially evolves the right answer over time. And I'm drawing a blank. I hate on that. Hate that. All right. Anyway, what can expert systems do and not do? Well, an expert system can reduce personnel time spent on issues, can help reduce errors, can improve consistency, and can aggregate information from various sources. So there is a lot of potential here. But what it can't do is use common sense. It can't automate all processes, and it can't make split-second decisions, although it can reduce the time it takes to make most unstructured decisions. Right? Now, what's interesting, though, is in the book, near the end of this section, they talk about how expert systems were talked about and used. There was a lot developed back in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 1970s, with the promise that they could really help out in a lot of industries. One big example was in the medical industry, right, and helping to diagnose patient problems and to help find solutions or prescriptions to take care of these issues. But over time, they realized that the promise of these expert systems simply didn't pan out, because small changes, and then when you have this big, long list of if-then statements, sometimes a small change to an if-then statement in the middle of it can throw everything else off. And making sure you get the right order of if-then statements can make a big difference. So one change of the order can make a huge, huge difference, right? Maybe making the cases where it should have caught a disease where it didn't. So even though there was a lot of potential here, a lot of them still are not being used. Now, there are still a few cases where they are. But they're not as used as widely as they originally thought they would be. Now, one thing they have developed to help out with this is something called fuzzy logic, right? So decision making sometimes involves imprecise or subjective information, but computers require very precise information to apply the rules. Now, unfortunately, your book doesn't go too much into this either, but fuzzy logic is a way to deal with some of the subjective information, like someone says short, right? If someone has a short nap, what does that mean? You know, what is short? Is short 20 minutes? Is it 15 minutes? Is it 5 minutes? More precision would be better, but sometimes you don't have that type of precision. So what do? Well, fuzzy logic will help you deal with it. So it's a mathematical method of handling imprecise or subjective information, often used when programming expert systems. Now, these actually are being used in things like search engines. So in order to index all these different websites and to rank them, there has to be some subjectiveness in how you rank them. Google can use some precise numbers, but they're trying to basically what they're trying to do is develop a reputation score for different websites over specific terms. And reputation is not something that's very easy to just measure. So they do, by necessity, use some fuzzy logic in that. Another example might be washing machines. So, for example, a washing machine has to deal with people inputting lots of different loads of laundry. Well, how much water do you need with the amount of clothes that you put in? Well, it's not very easy to figure out the consistency of the clothing, the how heavy it is, how much water to apply to it, so that you have enough to get it clean, but not too much, so that it's wasted. And again, I'm using a lot of subjective terms here, right? Now, what too much, too little. So it has to use some fuzzy logic in order to correctly calculate, how best to wash the clothes. And it may sound very odd that a washing machine would need this, but it does, right? It's not a very precise information. It doesn't just fill it up to a certain line anymore of water and say, we're going to put this much water in until it reaches a certain level. And certainly it could, but it's not the best way of doing it. And so a lot more of these newer washing machines now are developing using expert systems, but in a very delimited sense, and using a lot of fuzzy logic to better calculate how much water to apply. And same thing applies with something like anti-lock brakes as to when to apply them. And there's so many different factors that can go into it that eventually they found that using a little bit of fuzzy logic, a little bit of ambiguity, makes them far more effective than to have hard and precise rules that don't always apply. All right, well, this was a very short discussion today about knowledge management and expert systems. And hopefully, though, this will give you a little bit more foundation for thinking through, why knowledge management is useful, why expert systems can be useful. And in particular, the idea is, though, we want to help people make decisions by trying to capture the knowledge of the people in the organization, and then applying that in some sort of systematic method, right? So knowledge management systems and expert systems help with that process. Well, that's all that we really want to cover in Chapter Extension 11. While there is some interesting discussion about hypersocial organizations, we're not going to cover that. Also, content management systems. Again, a very fascinating topic. And something that I actually use when I develop my websites. And they do go beyond just websites, but there are lots of different types of content management systems. Just realize we're creating a lot of content, but we need to manage how that is presented and displayed and who has access to it. And so that's where content management systems really help out. But at any rate, I'm not going to dig into the details of those. Just know that there are a lot of great tools out there that can help with this objective of really transferring knowledge. But that's it for today, and we'll be back.